In this module, we will be talking about perception, and as you can see from the chapter outline, there is a lot to talk about when it comes to perception in cognition. We will start off talking about the nature of perception. We'll talk about mostly the complexity of perception. We'll also get back to information that we talked about in the second module about neurons. And then as you can see toward the very end, we will start dipping into memory. Like with the other lectures, I'm only going to focus on a couple of things here, one of which is just talking about what perception is. And then I want to focus mostly on um, information for human perception. We'll talk about various theories about perception and how we go about perceiving stimuli that are in our environment. And this in particular will be relevant for the activities that we do in this module, as well as the critical thinking conversation that we'll be having. So let's go ahead and get started and talk about what perception is. Perception is the experience that results from the stimulation of our senses. And so this is a direct continuation of what we talked about in Module 2. A couple of things to note about perception. Perception can change based on added information. In other words, it's not just cut and dry. We don't always get what we see or get what we perceive. So for example, as we get closer to an object, our perception of it might change. As we move further away, our perception of that object might change. So perception can change based on added information. That sounds very simple, but it's actually a very important concept. Another important concept to remember is that perception involves a process that's very similar to reasoning or to problem solving. Again, perception is not just cut and dry. Because it does change depending on added information, we actually can go through a process of how we perceive stimuli that are in the environment. And finally, perceptions occur in conjunction with actions. In order to act, we need to perceive. And so both action and perception appear and occur in concert. Let's take a look at how we can understand perception. There are two different theories that we can talk about. One is called a direct perception theory. And with both of these theories, keep in mind that perception is built on a foundation of information that exists in the environment. And so how do we go about perceiving that information that's in the environment? And so one type of theory is called a direct perception theory. This is also referred to as bottom-up processing, and that's exactly what it sounds like. According to this perspective, or this approach, perception comes from stimuli that are in the environment. The parts of that stimuli are identified and put together, and then recognition occurs. And we'll talk in more detail about this and discuss a couple of examples. Another type of theory are called constructive perception theories, and those are also just what they sound like. That suggests that we construct reality. For example, we might engage in top-down processing, and this is where we actively construct our perceptions using information that is based on expectations. So let's take a more careful look at bottom-up processing as well as top-down processing. And we'll start with bottom-up processing. Perception may start with the senses, and in fact it typically does start with the senses. And according to bottom-up processing, or when we engage in bottom-up processing, we are just processing just raw incoming data. All right, so basically a kind of black and white perception of that stimulus. That energy, that physical energy which gets converted to electrical energy, registers on our receptors, right? So plain and simple, this is just what exists is what my senses register. Well, contrast that with top-down processing. And this suggests that perception may start with the brain, right? And that's why, think about this, it's called top down. It starts with the brain. In top down processing, we use information about our prior knowledge, our experiences, our expectations. And as you can imagine, this is where the fuzziness comes in, right? This is where it starts to become interesting, right? This is bottom up is basically kind of like just black and white, but this is where we start to see that we can both be looking at the exact same thing, and you might see something completely different than I do because of our prior knowledge differs, our experience differs, and our expectations differ. So, for example, in this picture of just strictly bottom up processing, right? This is just Gil looking at Mary. And in bottom up processing, right, we see that we have light is reflected from Mary, so that is the sensory stimulus. It imposes an image on Gil's retina. Gil's retina sends electrical signals in the optic nerve, and that stimulates the brain. All right, so plain and simple, that is bottom up processing. We'll contrast that now with top down processing. This is called multiple personalities of a blob, and this is what the blob is here. And this blob actually appears in picture B, C, and D. What's amazing here is that all of the objects are the same. In B, C, and D, they are all exactly the same, but we perceive them differently because of our prior knowledge, our prior experiences, and what we expect to see in each one of these scenes, right? That's the complexity of how we perceive objects. And again, just going back, bottom up is that we just see this image. We don't process it, we don't interpret it, boom, we just see it. In top down processing, we start to assign meaning to it. So let's take a look at two examples, one of which is how these processing differences work in hearing words in a sentence and then in experiencing pain. When you hear words in a sentence spoken in a foreign language, your ability to pick out or understand certain words is based on the context that is demonstrated in top-down processing. So let's imagine that you are listening to a baseball game that is broadcast in Spanish, and let's just imagine that you don't understand Spanish. Well, you can actually pick up certain words because of context. Right, and it's also known as speech segmentation. We have the ability to tell when one word ends and another begins. So, for example, you may have had young children, and when you listen to young children speak, sometimes they speak in gibberish, and as adults we have no idea what they're saying, but guess what, their siblings do, because it's like they're speaking their own language, right? Because they have that ability, they have that top-down processing that we have long forgotten, right? So this is an example of how we can use context to understand something that we don't even really understand, but because there is enough similarity, we can pick that out, we can infer from context, we can make meaning based on our prior knowledge and our prior experiences. Let's take a look at experiencing pain. There was an early model called the direct pathway model. And this early model emphasized something called nociceptors that would send pain messages directly to the brain. And this was a bottom-up processing model. It suggested that if I take a hammer and I whack you on the toe with it, you're going to experience pain. And in fact, if I whack everybody's toe with a hammer, the experience of pain is going to be exactly alike. Well, we know that that's not true, right? More recent models have found that our expectations, our attention and distraction can affect how we experience pain in a top-down manner. It turns out that we all experience pain differently. I mean, even the same kind of pain. I may whack you on the toe with the hammer on one day, but if I do it on the next day and I distract you, it's not going to hurt as much, right? This suggests that our perception of pain, our experience of pain, is actually top down. And if you think that that's not true, think about the placebo effect, right? The key to the placebo effect is believing that the substance will reduce pain or it will alleviate the symptoms. Why does that work? Because of top-down processing. All right, finally, I just want to quickly touch on Helmholtz's theory of unconscious inference because it has to do with top-down processing. He realized that images on the retina are ambiguous. And so as a result, some of our perceptions are the result of unconscious assumptions that we make about the environment. Why does that happen? Because we use our knowledge to inform our perceptions. We infer much of what we know about the world. We don't need to sometimes hear things. We don't need to see things. We can fill in the gaps. We can fill in the blanks. He talked about the likelihood principle. We perceive the world in the way that is most likely based on our past experiences. So, for example, in this image, right? If this is an image that may appear on our retina, why do we think that this pattern on the retina was created by overlapping rectangles, which is what we perceive in A? But in fact, it could be a blue rectangle in front of a red rectangle, or it could be this kind of odd object here. Why do we perceive this as an image that's created by overlapping rectangles? Because of the likelihood principle. So what I hope that you get from this lecture is this sense of the difference between bottom up and top down processing. And in our activities for this module, as well as the critical thinking question, we will focus on how our experiences, our prior knowledge can impact our perception.